Welcome to Go For Side Effects. I'm your host, Kevin Simon. You all know my lovely co-host, Wade. How are you, man?
How's it going, guys?
You doing good, Mr. Renard?
Absolutely.
And Wade, today we got Nathan Teach. Nathan, how are you doing, man?
Doing good, sir. How you doing?
Doing good. Well, today is really going to be a really cool episode because we're going to be talking about depleted uranium. About a week or two ago, we discussed this in little detail with the Marine we had. What was his name, Wade? Philip. Philip, man. Philip kind of got a little bit into this and talked about how depleted uranium works, but we're really going to talk because Nathan, tell everybody a little bit about what was your main job while you were in theater during the second Gulf War.
I was a UH-60 helicopter repairman. I was a crew chief on the Blackhawks. It was
right.
My primary duty position.
And what years was that?
Well, that was so 23 years in total, but I did 03 to 04 for Iraq, the initial push with 4th ID, and then 05, 06 again with 4th ID to Taji.
Okay, so when you went into boot camp and decided that you wanted to work on the Blackhawk, which did you fly in it? Because most maintenance people do have to fly in the Blackhawk, correct?
Yeah, I spent right at 20 years of my my enlistment on flight status with the UH-60s, all the way through brigade level stands. It's been flying crew chief has been just what I wanted to do the whole time.
Yeah, flying crew chief. Yeah, no way, man. Y'all's life expectancy on that and Blackhawks are not very long. So when did you go into boot camp? What years?
It was May 16th of 2000 when I actually left Arkansas.
Oh, before 9/11.
Before 9/11, yes.
And then when 9/11 hit down, you went in, all that. But before that, you decided you wanted to go in before 9/11.
I did, yeah. It was a rock and a hard place type situation. I was in college. My university lost its accreditation for one reason or another, so my credit hours became, non-existent. So at that point, it was figure out what I wanted to do in my local town, my hometown, or leave. And so I joined the military, just kind of looking for a change of scenery, which was pretty good. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed my time, but I went Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and then Fort Eustis, Virginia, and then to Korea for my first duty station up at Camp Stanley, up north of the No Smile line in 2000. So 9/11, I was in Korea. We were actually in the field in Korea when it happened. So it was kind of a surreal moment. I remember walking in and asking what movie was playing on the TV, watching the jets crash into the Twin Towers. I had no idea it was live TV. And then they recalled us back and obviously locked us down on post. But yeah, I was over in Korea for 9/11 and then came back to Fort Hood and went on the initial push up in 2003 with 2-4 Aviation.
Well, I don't know about y'all, but I can remember I was driving when I exited to go to our shop when everything started happening. When I got to the shop, that's when I realized, holy crap, we're under attack. And I mean, it's funny because I think Alan Jackson wrote a song about 9/11. Everybody knows where you were, you know.
Well, I think that it goes to like the generation before us remembers where they were when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. For us, we know where we were at for 9/11. I think it's the same idea, same symbolism. And I truly believe that. We know, our generation knows where we were at.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I mean, your generation wasn't that far behind us because you were in.
Well, no, I mean that's what I mean.
Right.
Our age range group, we know if you were alive for 9/11 and had a memory, you know where you're at.
I mean, he really isn't that younger than us. He just has darker hair. Yeah, I mean, really, and I don't understand it, but
okay. You gotta start getting to the gray hairs.
About to have my 25th birthday on Wednesday.
Yeah, see, you're only 10 years behind us, 9. Who's counting? But I mean, so when you actually went over there for the first time over to Iraq.
Mhm.
Let's talk about that experience, where you landed in and all that.
So we went in through Kuwait. Initially, we were supposed to push through Turkey, and we were part of that force that got diverted south. So we were in Kuwait at Camp Udari for a little while, waiting on our equipment to show back up, and then we were on the initial push north across the berm in the end of March, beginning of April 2003. So helicopter battalion, you have to go through progression, if you're a flight crew member. So that obviously hadn't happened yet because of the timeline between when I left Korea and when I got to Fort Hood and when we deployed. So I was an unprogressed crew chief. So I was driving the first sergeant's Humvee. So I had the experience of driving a 4-door soft shell Humvee with no top on it from Kuwait all the way through into Tikrit East, the airfield, is where we wound up setting up camp for our unit anyway.
Let's see what's crazy.
So that 3-day convoy across all of Iraq was
yeah, and y'all pushed further in than what we did. We only pushed to a certain distance and then we stopped. Y'all pushed all the way in. And that's what made y'all's war a little bit more difficult than what ours is. And y'all also really didn't have, the United Nations coalition group, right?
At that moment, no. I mean, they were there after, but you're very what's the word I'm looking for? Tunnel visioned in a situation like that, where you're just kind of focused on what you're doing, and you just kind of trust that everybody else is doing what they're supposed to do, because you don't, you can't see the big picture. You're just driving, you're following the guy in front of you. You hope that somebody has a map. It's just, you're just going with it.
Right.
Well, didn't y'all have GPS?
We did with the lead vehicles, yeah. In the convoy, they did, but everything was so. When we got the go order, it was very, very rushed. It was just kind of like mad scramble. We're doing it. Everybody go, kind of thing.
Yeah, it kind of wasn't as planned like Desert Storm was. And that's what a lot of people need to understand. It wasn't as planned like the coalition forces did during Desert Storm, because we had months to prepare, and then all of a sudden we just did it. And so, and y'all got over there, y'all pretty much went in. And so I have two young men that one of my coworkers, his boys were in. And the one thing I didn't understand is how they sent both of his boys over to Iraq and not in green zones, neither. And I was like, oh, shouldn't one of them be behind? Because he's the only one, the youngest one will be your last offspring to carry your name. But apparently, I don't think they cared. It was kind of weird. I mean,
well, I like a lot of things. I mean,
I don't know if they do that anymore. I don't know if that's a thing anymore, or if that.
I think it is, but I haven't personally experienced it. I've heard about it, but I haven't actually seen anybody fall under it. But just like everything else in the military, if you don't say, right, if nobody raises it, if nobody says, hey, by the way, they don't even worry about it. They just keep going on. A lot of things get lost by the wayside because nobody mentions it. They just assume it's not a thing.
All right. Now I want to get into the depleted uranium part, how you actually came across all this, because this is interesting.
So the initial push in, we were basically directly behind, the convoy of Army vehicles. At lead of that convoy was the Marines, and then they had close air support with the Air Force. And what they were doing was like a leapfrog. So from every military installation from Kuwait north, they were moving in. The Air Force was strafing, dispersing the enemy. Marines would go in and clear. Army ground forces would move in and occupy. They'd regroup, and it would move out all the way up. So it was Talil, and then it was Baghdad, and then it was Balad, and then all the way up into Tikrit, where we stopped. And we were just shedding parts of this convoy as we went throughout the entire theater of operations, just everybody that had their own marching orders. So when we got to Tikrit East, which became known as Camp Spiker later on that year, we all got our marching orders. The airfields had been cratered, the runways had been cratered, a lot of the hangars had been blown up. So we were assigned these, we called them fast active hangars, but they're basically a concrete bunker that you could fit a jet in, and it has exhaust on the back of it, so the jet can run up and taxi out and just hit the runway and take off. Those were assigned to 2-4 Aviation as our maintenance hangars and our HHC brigade, all that stuff. So, foreign object damage is a big thing for helicopters, right? So getting there and getting our marching orders, and our platoon sergeant's like, hey, that's ours. I went and grabbed the broom and I went in there to get it cleaned out and get it ready for our aircraft, which were coming in behind us, right? So that we could get them whatever maintenance needed to get done. I walk into this bunker, and it looked like it had been used as a machine shop. And I say that because there was all these little metal rods about 4 inches long, inch in diameter, pointy on one end, like they had been turned down in a lathe, and there was just laying on the floor inside of this bunker. And as I'm sweeping with the broom, I hit one, and it sparked when it went across the floor. And it just struck me as odd, because I'm like, well, that's not what normal steel acts like, right? So in true, dumb fashion, I picked it up, right, and was like, wow, this is very heavy, and it was still shiny. There was no evidence of corrosion on it. And then I kind of looked at the wall, and I see that there's these holes in the wall, this concrete, reinforced concrete bunker. There's holes in the wall, and then there's chunks of concrete taken out of the floor. And these metal rods fit those holes. And so I set it down, and I went and got the radiation detector from our NBC kit, and checked them. And sure enough, they were all registering, 120 or so, 130 on the meter. So raised the alarm to my chain of command. Everybody kind of pulled back. I got the marching orders to continue the cleanup, because I had already been exposed, and we were austere environment with an expeditionary force. So there wasn't it's not like we could move to a different location. What we had is what we had. It was all there was to it. So the decision was made to clean it up and get it out of there. So I spent the next 2.5 hours roughly just policing up inside that bunker, and then the area surrounding that bunker. And we had, at this point, our entire unit had been notified. So I'm assuming, although I haven't been able to confirm it, that same cleanup detail happened for all the other bunkers down the row, if you will. And then once we had that collected, roughly, about 50 pounds, I approximately took it out to the desert and buried it, got it out of the way, and then came back in from that. And my squad leader was looking at the radiation detector, and he just kind of waved it across my midsection, and it was reading about 886 rads. So pretty serious, severe dose. I got pretty lucky with that initial exposure in that respect. But then again, the oversight that I was talking about, we just set up tents directly in that same spot, and that's where we conducted operations for the next year, which is realistically the crux of the problem with the depleted uranium, is the dust and the residue, not so much the debris. I have friends of mine that I've told this story to that were never notified. Nobody ever found it. And so these metal rods were laying all over the airfield and other places across Iraq. And these guys can remember throwing them at each other, putting them in each other's helmet bags, and, just playing games while they're waiting on mission execution orders, and had no clue that they're radioactive material that they're playing with.
See, that's what I think is crazy is, I mean, be honest with you, I would have picked it up, probably thrown it at people, just have fun.
Well, that's what
You know
soldiers
what?
do, right? Like,
Yeah. Wade probably would have like, hey, we can make a weapon out of this, whatever it is.
A good toy. But
Yeah.
so are these tips, are we thinking that these are the actual tips of a DU round? Is that what these are?
The center, yeah, what they were was the ones that I found specifically were identified as 30 millimeter depleted uranium armor piercing rounds. So it was the actual depleted uranium penetrator from the center of the round.
Right. And that's what Philip was talking about last week about the pointed tip of it. Yeah. So
yeah, what made DU so purpose built for that was that it self sharpens on a molecular level. So as it hits something hard, as it's disintegrating, as the metal's coming apart, its lattice, its matrix is actually shedding in a way that keeps it pointy. So it has incredible penetrating power because of that. And it's a very dense metal, but it is still radioactive.
Because he was actually talking about when it actually hit, it'd make a small hole, but anything once it hit inside and it exploded, that's when everything just disintegrated.
So there is an exothermic part that goes with it. It does create a lot of heat and some very hot debris. The way the round is set, you've got the center rod, and then there's basically a charge behind it,
right,
encased in another casing that's the total outside diameter. So when it impacts, that impact triggers the secondary charge, and that's what blasts the rod through whatever it is that it's getting hit, and that creates a lot of destruction. They're incredibly effective, but they're also extremely toxic. So
now, since it was hitting like a concrete bunker like that, is that probably the reason why those rods actually survived?
Something softer, yeah. I would venture a guess to say yes, that is the case.
Versus like a tank or an armored vehicle.
Yeah, the risk is still there. It's just a powdered form,
But I'm saying, as far as like you actually having the rod intact, because of going through concrete versus metal.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Not exploding or just being destroyed in the explosion.
Yeah.
So see, now you actually have evidence to hold in your hand, basically, literally.
Literally. Unfortunately, yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And then that exposure was documented throughout my entire chain of command, from brigade down. A couple weeks later, the civilians I'm assuming they were the civilians for the ILER documentation, came out. I say I'm assuming that because it's in my ILER, but they didn't tell me who they were. I was just told by my first sergeant, hey, take these people out to that DU that you buried. And then that's when I found out that one of the other guys that was part of that, he had to go dig it up and move it because we had put a fighting position out there in the same spot that it was buried in. So he caught me in the middle of it, and he's like, I'll take these guys out there because I know where it's at now. And he had to go. So at some point, the massive amount that we had already collected up and buried had to get dug up and moved by another individual.
Were they wearing suits?
No. So that was kind of one of the problems. And again, mad scramble to get out of Kuwait, on the way up. All we had was our one go to war NBC suit, still sealed in the vacuum bag. So it was, we didn't want to open it. It was all we had, right? And there was still a risk of chemical weapons, or so we thought. Actually, there was still a risk of chemical weapons. So it was kind of one of those things where it was, I don't want to say it was taken lightly because it was taken seriously, but it was just kind of a thing. And then we moved on, right? And shortly after that, everybody got sick with dysentery. So it quickly became something in the past because, people were much more concerned about.
And probably nothing happened to you immediately.
Well, I went through radiation sickness. I did. I had about 2 weeks. I wouldn't say it was severe. I wouldn't be sitting here if it was severe, but you know, and that's where you get into kind of the semantics of the dose models and how they affect you, and then how it affects each individual person, because it's different for each individual. And that's why this is such a slippery topic when it comes to acknowledging.
And I only meant that by like, it wasn't a gunshot where you can see immediate effects to you right now. So that's why it got put in the rear view.
Yeah. I mean, after the cleanup detail, like within 24 hours, I had severe heartburn, severe acid reflux that would not go away. Didn't matter what, you know, water, MREs, stuff that never bothered me. All of a sudden, I'm, you know, like feel like my throat's on fire. I had a sunburn like condition on my body, but it was through my clothing. So you could see my belt and my t-shirt and everything on my skin.
That's crazy.
It started to mess with my fingernails and my gums. Probably the most concerning part was within about 4 days, I was passing sections of my intestinal lining when I was using latrine, which is not a pleasant thing. I had, you know, one of the docs from the aid station was coming over and periodically checking on me and the other 2 individuals that were part of the cleanup.
Now, were they having the same things going on as you?
Not as bad. I was the guy that was carrying the box with all of the DU residue in it. They were looking for it visually and then confirming it with the meter. And so it was, you know, mitigating exposure. I'm carrying the MRE box with a trash bag, and then I'm just putting this stuff in it as we're carrying it and going around. So that was like the initial exposure dose. And then, you know, like I said, that lasted about 2.5 weeks. We didn't have the ability to medevac anyone, or I probably would have been, honestly, but I got better. You know, everything kind of went worse and then it got better. And so again, you know, focus on the things kind of more important to you, you know, while you're in an austere environment, you know, with even no perimeter fence.
Just trying to get out of there, just and try to be done with the war.
Right.
And so, you know, talking about over there, you know, because like we had what was called the highway of death. And I don't know if you ever got to know what that road was or got to see it, but I've seen pictures, and it's amazing what that depleted uranium will do.
Yep.
And
I flew over that thing many, many times because we used to do, well, we did a lot of runs. Our theater, our footprint was all the way from basically Turkey, the eastern border, all the way down to Kuwait. We were doing PAX runs and all the way in between. So it was, we would fly down there at least once a week. We'd fly down to Kuwait and we'd go across all of that. And,
yeah, because we had Hector on, and Hector was like, it was really weird to drive back down that road again. And still seeing vehicles out there. And I mean, I saw some pictures that was just unbelievable what that stuff can do. And so I could imagine, I mean, our military top guys don't quite understand that not every depleted uranium round is going to magically turn into powder. Some rods are probably still going to be left over.
Well, what's scarier than that is it doesn't matter, right? Whether it's a solid rod or if it's the powdered dust, I would argue, is probably worse, because the way the radiation affects you, if it can get in your body, it's exponentially more detrimental to you than it is exterior exposure. So it has an affinity for the proteins on your DNA, and so it'll adhere. And then as it's basically breaking down, it's blowing apart your genetic code of your cells, and then that genetic code heals itself, but not the same way that it was. And so then you start to get these genetic cellular abnormalities, which then become more and more. So every time that cell reproduces from that point on, it's different, right? And so what happens is you have the acute radiation sickness from radiation if it was strong enough to cause that. But 25 years down the road, you develop a thyroid problem, or you develop lung cancer, or you develop, kidney cancer or liver, you name it. it's going to affect each person different, right? And that's kind of the problem, right? There's no way to determine what genetic material it destroyed when you were exposed to it, or what that material is then not going to do that it's supposed to do in your body. So
Right.
go ahead. Yeah. So the issue is, and you know, my big push, right, is there was that initial cleanup detail that was bad enough, but then the part that wasn't taken into consideration is the fact that the entire country is basically a radioactive hot zone, right? Because every one of these bases was strafed like that, every one of these places. So you have at least some depleted uranium powdered metal just in the soil. And if you've been to Iraq, you know that that soil does not stay on the ground, right? It is like moon dust. It goes everywhere. We were a helicopter battalion, so we made it exponentially worse because we're creating dust storms everywhere we went, you know. So through scientists that I've spoken with throughout the years, and ones that actually went to Iraq and studied this, their estimated background radiation levels for anybody that was over there is roughly 30 to 50 rads, which is 6 to 10 times the max allowable safe dosage, according to the American exposure model. So every year you were in theater, you got 6 to 10 times your safe radiation dose on top of the uranium heavy metal poisoning, because that's a whole separate problem, because it acts just like lead or arsenic. So you've got a two-pronged problem. And we used over, I think, rough estimates, we shot over 300 tons of it in 2003 alone, in just that one theater of operations. So it was, and on top of that, to compound it, the majority of it was used where service members were then encamped. You know, so
Right. But this was also, when we're talking about the scientists and researchers, was also about the first Gulf War, also that it wasn't just post 9/11, it was also Desert Storm that they determined.
Right. Yeah. So
Right.
Dr. Busby, Chris Busby, he's a British national. He was in charge of the teams that went over with NATO to study the depleted uranium effects in theater. They did that around 2000, 2001. So those studies happened after the first Gulf War, starting into, you know, just prior to the second. And his findings were then published, you know, to NATO. And the shift was made from depleted uranium to tungsten as our armor piercing munition. And so 2001 timeframe is when that happened. The war stock of depleted uranium wasn't expended until roughly 2008, but that's a ballpark. I really haven't been able to iron that out 100%. But
meaning they were allowed to use everything that we had supply already manufactured. Hey, go ahead and use it up.
Yeah, I mean,
burn it
I
up.
would say that's a speculation, but yes, I mean, that seems like what happened, because we were obviously using it. So
Right. And one of the things that I find important about this podcast is this affects both Gulf War 1 and 2, and it also, I mean, everything out there, burn pits. I mean, I don't know. Did y'all have oil well fires or anything
we did,
like that?
yes. Yeah,
Okay.
we did.
See, so y'all basically the same stuff y'all did, but y'all's burn pits were worse than what our burn pits were, from what I understand.
They were bad, and then they got them under control. I mean, when the wind would shift, it was horrible. But yeah, I mean, it was gigantic open pit in the ground where everything went in there. You know, you name it, it got thrown in there.
Right. And I mean,
which Kevin, you and I've talked, you know, like our burn pits from Desert Storm, you know, I've been to bonfires that were bigger versus their burn pits, you know, that like you said. Yeah. And then once they actually established a foothold, you know, there and started having bases built, then that even got that much worse. You know, I mean, they were bulldozers that are pushing all the waste and trash and then burning it. And then, like he says, the wind's just night and day different. I mean, when you want to talk about burn pits, there is no argument, you know, post 9/11, that was a burn pit.
And this is where me and Wade always talk about the difference between post 9/11 and ours is we had what we blew up bunkers. So we had that going on mainly for the Army and the Marines. And then we had oil well fires. And then I guess what they call burning poop is the biggest thing I've heard about so far.
Yeah, that's
fantastic. You gotta do that.
I had to say it. Wait, I'm sorry. I had to say it.
Well, and
I had to say it.
You know, Desert Storm was a proving ground, and it was a proving ground that depleted uranium rounds were very highly effective. I mean, that was the first time that they used it to that extent that it worked. I mean, and what did Joe, who'd never seen that before, what did he want to do? He wanted to go look at it.
Right.
And every time we came across a tank or a truck, we wanted to see a burn up body. We wanted to see what it did. We had no idea. What burned the hell out of this vehicle? What could do that? And then, you know, and like he says, there's all this ionizing radiation just floating around in the air, and you're breathing it in. It's going through it's going in your eyes and your mucous membranes, you know, and God forbid you touch anything.
Like cigarettes on a dead body.
You don't pick up cigarettes on the well, you know Joe did that. Or
right.
So you got a dead body, and let's just say some idiot would take the uniform or piece of equipment. Okay, now it's contaminated. I mean, it's just common sense. Now looking back.
And that's you know, the same problem, right? More of the same, because when people came back, we were never decontaminated for radiation. The equipment was never decontaminated. So all that stuff came back, which is kind of when you look at it, like the VA, the Terra Act addresses it. It's an important document. It actually states depleted uranium and radiation by name as known hazards in these area of operations, and it covers a period from the end of Vietnam to current. National Guard, Reserve, active duty, doesn't matter whether they deployed or not. So the VA through the Terra Act is actually acknowledging the fact that this stuff came home because the equipment, you know, wasn't. And so you had people at like the railheads and at the warehouses getting dosed with radioactive material on this side of it. And so there's no proof of exposure required for that, just a DD-214 review. But they do that. And then they refuse to acknowledge that it actually causes any problems, you know? So for me, you know, that happened in 2003. I had my 21st birthday when I was deployed in 03, right?
I did too. Not in 03.
Great time. You know? So by the age of 25, I was suffering from, I didn't know it, but I was suffering from full on testosterone deficiency. What they call hypogonadism. So, and, you know, of course they're trying to blame it on PTSD. They're trying to blame it on, you know, adrenal blowout. They're trying to blame it on all these things. But realistically, I'd come home and I'd sit down and I would not have the energy to move. And then the next morning I'd get up to go to PT and I just had been sitting on the couch all night. You know, I was, you know, had the brain fog. I had just this whole litany of issues, but no explanation for a otherwise normal 25-year-old male. After that first deployment, we had annotated that we were exposed to depleted uranium. It had made it to our post-deployment health assessments, and myself and a couple other individuals were ordered to go give residual radiation testing at Darnell Army Hospital. We never heard anything back from that. You know, we had submitted the 24-hour urine samples and didn't hear anything. I left Fort Hood in 2007. I went to Korea for 2 years, still struggling with all of these problems. And around 2009, came back, went to Fort Campbell, deployed to Afghanistan for a year, and then PCS from Fort Campbell shortly after that and went to Fort Rucker, Alabama. And that was important for me medically because Fort Rucker has an aid station. They don't have an actual hospital. So all of my treatment then went to civilian doctors, which is important when you're somebody that was my age with the problems that I was suffering from that nobody could figure out. First thing a civilian doctor does is, well, let's check your hormone levels, right? The Army assumes that that's not going to be a problem. They don't have that set up. So, you know, around 2012 is when they actually figured out that I was hypogonadic. And they started me on testosterone replacement. And then as soon as they determined that, they were like, well, go get a sleep study, because if you're hypogonadic, you probably have sleep apnea. So and lo and behold, there's that one. So that was the first two things that we did to fix problems, and those helped. But then that kind of got me like on the thought process of, well, where did this come from? Right? Because nobody in my family has a genetic predisposition to hormone problems, hormone imbalance. So I was like, well, normally that's a genetic problem. This is not you came across something funky, unless it was radiation, And so I started digging, and I was like talking to my primary care manager, and I was, saying, hey, I got a big dose of radiation. And at the time, my ignorance, I didn't fully understand the problem. So I was treating it like that exposure that happened in 2003 was it, like the problem was gone once we buried it in the desert.
Right.
And so a lot of my paperwork looks that way. It wasn't until years later that we started to, the environmental exposure that everybody got. Right. So I talking to my primary care manager, trying to get this paperwork and, maybe see if there was something else we could look into. And he let me know that there was no residual radiation testing in my records. He's like, there's a lab request for it, but there's no results. And then he showed me, and sure enough, there's the lab request, April 2004, for residual radiation testing, but no results available. And so then that started me down the path of, let me get a hold of some people. Let me see if somebody else has it so I can turn it into him, because he was hesitant to actually start ordering any additional testing for me because we didn't have any proof that it happened. So that started the process. I began to, reach out to, other members of my unit from that deployment, and come to find out, none of us even have a deployment medical record from that deployment. We didn't take our actual medical records with us. We took jackets, right. Blank jackets. They filled them while we were there, and then they were supposed to get put back into our regular jackets when we got home. Well, apparently there was a Connex fire that destroyed all of those records prior to them being uploaded into
Ain't that amazing?
Into the digital system. Now, what's even more amazing is I called Fort Hood's fire department and asked for a historical check to see if they actually had record of a fire happening in 2004 on the airfield, and they couldn't find one. So take that for what you will.
Look at it like this. I think I heard they had a fire for Vietnam for this storm. Amazing.
Well, this one's going to be even more amazing for you. So the next step was, okay, the document that I needed was the post-deployment health assessment, right? Because that actually said depleted uranium by name on the back. So contacted the archives, requested a copy. And if you go onto the archive website, all three of my deployments are listed. They're all there. The 2003 PDHRA is not available for viewing. So I requested a paper copy of it. I got an email back, and unfortunately I lost this email when I retired, but the email stated that document had been destroyed in a warehouse fire at the archives around 2016. But what's weird about that is the other two post-deployment health assessments from 2005 and 2010 are available for viewing, and you can download them. They still have the physical copies of them. So what that's saying to me is that the fire destroyed one piece of paper in a folder that contained numerous pieces of paper at the time that the fire happened. And there's no evidence of that fire on the other photocopies that I got from the other two PDHRAs. So there's another problem. Then we move in and we find out that around 2008, environmental health with the Army changed the hazard category of depleted uranium from a radiation hazard to a environmental hazard. So it's listed in the same hazard category as like anthrax, even though it has a radioactive signature. And I'm not 100% sure the difference between those categories, but the lady that informed me of that change at environmental health said it probably has something to do with the tracking, like how you have to actually document where it is and and where it was utilized. So there's just another facet into this, this problem. As we moved forward, I kept trying to get things recreated. At this point, I'm suffering from the low testosterone's been curbed. The sleep apnea, the CPAP machine is helping, but I'm still suffering from these abnormal weight fluctuations and like 12 to 14 inches in a 24-hour period of abdominal increase, right? Which for somebody in the military is a bad thing,
Right.
So I'm playing Russian roulette every day, with what's going on here, because it's like any given day I could have gotten a tape test and it would have been the end of my career. So there was a lot of stress associated with this. And I mean, I'm doing 2-a-days. I am on a very strict diet. I am exercise. I am trying to do everything I possibly can to maintain a physically fit appearance, but it was just completely random. I couldn't figure it out. And there's pages of documentation in my medical record where I went to the doctors about this, and I went to, nutritionists and you name it. And I got the same standard. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. Oh, it's, you're eating unhealthy. It's this kind of thing. It's that kind of thing. And it was just the runaround. So at the same time, I'm trying to get some kind of medical protection, because at this point I've established there's a medical problem with me that we don't know what it is. And, but it's affecting me physically to the point that my career is in jeopardy. So I'm working on trying to get a medical exemption, something like that. And at the same time, I'm trying to rebuild my records from what was lost. So
Right.
I reached out to the chief of the DoD program at the time for depleted uranium, who was the two individuals I spoke with, Dr. Bob Cherry and Dr. Jerry Fallow. And interestingly enough, they were the ones in charge of the program back on the first Gulf War. So told them my situation, and they actually assisted getting the residual radiation testing done again. This was in around 2022. So they went through, they redid the residual radiation testing, and they found 235, 236, and 238 in my urine 22 years later. So
can we stop right there? Because I did have a question from our previous conversation. I told you that I did a urinalysis for the depleted uranium program through the VA.
Okay.
And it came back like 3, 4, 5 days later. I'm negative. I'm all good to go. Can you explain to me again why, or what the type of testing as to why that was probably a bogus reading?
Yeah. So the DoD and the VA both use a uranium spot test as their.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Uranium spot test is their initial. So basically, that's like it's almost like a heavy metal lab. It's looking for uranium total. It doesn't differentiate between man-made, naturally occurring. It just says, is it uranium? Yes or no. If you are not high enough to be outside of the normal category, which I think it's 5 nanograms per milliliter, something along those lines. If you're not above that with the VA, they won't even do any in-depth testing. They bragged to me, and this is kind of jumping ahead a ways, but they bragged to me that they could detect radiation or uranium isotopes all the way back from like 96, in a sample. And so I was like, oh, okay, but both of mine, and it's funny, but my bioassay from the Department of Defense and the depleted uranium sample that I submitted through environmental health or occupational health with the VA, both the initial uranium spot tests come back as negligible. But the DoD, in my case, did the in-depth testing anyway. So because I was on that test, it was negligible. So they said there was a possibility no exposure occurred, but they went ahead and did the in-depth testing, and they detected all 3 types of the uranium isotope, which is the smoking gun. So the uranium-236 is really the tattletale. That is not naturally occurring. It is only associated with the man-made depleted uranium. And so if you have uranium-236, that was man-made stuff. So 20 years after the fact, even with a spot test that said that there's negligible levels, I think the highest that I registered on the spot test was 11.95. So only slightly elevated. They weren't even, and they acknowledged that. But even with that spot test 20 years later, it was man-made uranium. And that's the problem with the system that we're facing right now, is because there's thousands of veterans that have gone to the VA. I think they even brag about it. I have, from a couple years ago, I have their depleted uranium sheet for providers. And on that document, it actually says over 8,500 veterans have applied for concerns on depleted uranium exposure, and only, I think, 5 were entered into their program. So the only people that are in the DU program for the VA right now have embedded fragments of depleted uranium in their body, the guys that actually caught shrapnel. And so they have a piece of metal that's obviously still emitting the radiation. Everybody
great.
else does too, by the way, but it's not, the way it works is it settles in your bone marrow, it settles in your tissues. And so there's a certain point where your body just doesn't flush it anymore, and you'll have a radiation level for the remainder of your life, unfortunately. But that is, so that is one of the current issues that needs to get fixed, that I'm hoping to raise awareness for, is the fact that the VA's depleted uranium exposure program is woefully inadequate for the amount of veterans that this affects. Because we're talking, just from the second Gulf War, we're talking 1.5 million service members, right, that have an environmental exposure just from being there. And then you have everybody from the first Gulf War that falls into that category as well. So arguably everybody that the TERA Act covers should also be entered into the DU program for the VA, because that's the program that's set up for them. But what's concerning to me is the VA is taking studies from those people at the DU lab, and they're comparing the medical problems with those people against their cohort group that aren't in the program. And they're saying, we don't see a difference, so it doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't cause any problems.
Right.
And so you're comparing apples to apples, because you're not acknowledging half of the exposure that happened, and so, I mean, even in my case with the VA specifically, they've acknowledged the DU and the radiation exposure. It's in my active problems list. They've diagnosed me with chronic multi-symptom illness, which is the new Gulf War syndrome. And they've said that is everything that's not musculoskeletal that's wrong with me. That is the words from the War-Related Injury and Illness Study Center. So I went through 2 years with the VA of, talking to my PCM, going through the state level VA, my case got elevated to the War-Related Injury and Illness Study Center. They dismissed it. They basically just copy pasted the first paragraph of my bio essay from the DOD that said possible no exposure occurred, and sent it back to me and said, go home. So I filed a congressional and basically forced them to see me. And initially they tried to tell me it was traveler's diarrhea. The symptoms that I had downrange were just traveler's diarrhea that never went away. And there was just a bunch of, there's no way it happened, this is not how it works, et cetera, et cetera. So then I started looking for, my own doctors. And I found Dr. Busby, and he did a case study on me and a dosimetry estimate, which I submitted to the VA. And then lo and behold, they're acknowledging it, and their second case review basically acknowledges all of it, and then recommends that I go to the DU lab in Baltimore for long-term exposure monitoring and care. I spoke with the people at the DU lab. They were absolutely excited to get me, there, because they, as one of them said, I represent a whole new exposure cohort that they're not paying attention to right now. But they did require a uranium spot test be submitted, because, as I was told, their system wouldn't let me get entered without it. And so I never had one done with the VA until that point, because the occupational health doctor that looked at me for the environmental exposures took one look at the records that I had and said, there's no reason to do any further testing. You already have all the proof in the world, you know? So they just pushed me past that point and sent me on for treatment. Right. The DU lab said they needed one. So I sent them a sample with all of my records attached to it to make sure that they had it. And I got contacted from the chief of their the home office, the Health Outcomes for Military Exposures, which is the umbrella organization that covers both the War-Related Injury and Illness Study Center and the DU lab in Baltimore. Dr. Patricia Hastings was her name, and she called me at home about 8 o'clock at night, my time, and told me that I was not getting entered into the program because I did not have embedded fragments of depleted uranium in my body. And she, through that phone call that I also have video recorded and emails back and forth, she just refused to acknowledge the exposure. She refused to acknowledge any kind of, I asked her very point blank questions like, okay, so you're saying that there's no uranium in my sample currently, but what about I'm already proven, this has already been a thing. We're not arguing whether it happened or not. We're arguing what it did. So what damage was done? Question mark.
Right.
Completely ignored, just pushed right past it. And a direct quote from her is, "We haven't studied depleted uranium enough to know what it does and doesn't do to the human body, but we know for a fact it doesn't cause chronic multi-symptom illness, which is Gulf War syndrome." So, and of course I responded with, "You can't say those two sentences back to back. That does,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
You haven't studied it, but we know it doesn't do something." Well, then you have studied it.
Well, you actually should have said, well, haven't they been studying it for 35 years with the first Desert Storm?
Well, and there's arguably they have, I'm
exactly they have.
Say, that this is not new. Everybody that I've spoken with about this issue, because I have taken it to different veterans organizations, I have taken it through anybody that will listen to it. And a lot of people don't act shocked when they hear about it, which is very telling to me. It means that this isn't the first time they've heard this,
or they know.
It becomes a problem. Like, I can appreciate the position of the VA with this. I don't condone it, but I can appreciate how hard it is, because now you're dealing with a toxic exposure that arguably the last 2 generations of service members are all suffering from to some extent. You have an exposure effect that causes different reactions with each person. So you have really no way of setting here's a list of known medical problems that we can attribute to this, like they normally do with, say, things in the PACT Act, stuff like that, right? Like there's specific illnesses or injuries that they can associate with it. You can't do that.
You mean like a whole list of cancers?
Right. So the problem then becomes the service connection for every individual, for every one of their medical conditions, until you can prove it wasn't caused by this problem. Right. It becomes that big of a deal. And then you have to start looking at the exposure scales, right? Like how they're actually calculating dosages. That's a whole separate issue that's getting looked into right now, because it's obviously it's very old and very outdated. And we've already shown in some other scientific papers that it's not accurate at all. But that's a separate can of worms from this. Realistically, I mean, the big takeaways in this is, everybody that went to at least Iraq, but every theater of operations that depleted uranium was used, this is a problem. So when I say that, start picturing in your mind, like every one of those little video clips that you saw of, infantry guys calling in close air support, and an A-10 comes in, and strafes the tree line, and then the dust just kind of settles over them.
Right.
It puts all of that into a different context, right?
Right. And we're getting close to the end of the program, but do you happen to have all that paperwork sitting right by you?
I do.
Can you please hold up that file real quick? Right there, we have literally been how can I put this? We've been talking to you for a while about this. We weren't sure exactly on how to present the show because we wanted people to really understand your story and what you went through. You have done your research.
Mm-hmm.
You have documents after documents proving everything that we talked about today. And that's why it's important for Desert Storms to understand is he did a lot of the documentation for you. And so, it's really important for each and every one of us not to take this lightly. And so we are about to go into the after show, but if you got one last thing that you would like to talk about.
I do. Thanks, Kevin. I will say that Nathan is probably one of the most knowledgeable of any subject we have ever had, hands down equal to or more so of any researcher that we've ever had on here. And I just want to ask Nathan, what is your end goal that you are trying to do, just so our listeners know what you personally are, your goal of what you're after?
We need to shift, obviously, in their out loud voice, acknowledgement of this problem. Step one, hands up for accountability. Let's acknowledge this problem. And then we need to change the way we're treating these veterans, especially with their medical care, because step number one for any radiation exposed person that's received a large dose of radiation in their life is to mitigate the amount of radiation they receive from that point on. So I don't know what you want to call it with the VA specifically when they have knowledge of this problem and they're still sending all these veterans off for nuclear medicine treatments with no regard for the high doses of ionizing radiation that they've received in their career. But it does not do anything for their life expectancy. I'll just put it that's putting it nicely. So there's a certain threshold for each person. And of course, it's different for every person where the radiation just becomes toxic. It's going to trigger your cells to go nuts. Something's going to happen. And that's a indeterminate point in space for each person. You have no idea. So you just mitigate that with every person. And since we're not doing that, it's just kind of hastening the inevitable, honestly, which is unfortunate. So we need to shift the medical care of these individuals to something more akin to a genetic therapy. Let's look at the damage that was done and let's bridge the gap in that damage. And let's start trying to figure out how we can get the human body to work past these broken links, in the DNA chain. And then, let's look at these individuals from a standpoint of this exposure happened, and treat it accordingly. Because right now we're just kind of, they're throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, because every last one of us is a genetically mutated individual, so even arguably,
you want it acknowledged. You want it acknowledged.
I want it acknowledged. And then, but more importantly, I really want them to just start acting like it actually happened, and
yeah,
medically, right? There's a lot of accountability. There's a lot of things you could argue for, but
right.
At the end of the day, that doesn't solve any of it.
Well, for me, I don't want my kids or grandkids to have to go through what we've all gone through. And that's actually going to be the purpose. So as we end this program, we're about to hit the after show. If anybody like to get a hold of us, y'all can get us on Facebook, and with Nathan, if you like to get a hold of him personally, you can contact me or Wade and we'll get you in touch with him, or just look him up on Facebook.
He's very active on Facebook.
He's very active on Facebook. And y'all get a hold of us at Kevin Simon at GoForSideEffects.com, Kevin Simon at GoForSideEffects.com. And I have a lot of doctors who actually do email me And so I'm hoping they'll see this and they'll email me and say, hey, we'd like to talk more about this. Also, go watch an after show. We're about to hit the after show in just a second, where I'm going to ask a little bit more questions in depth, where I know that Facebook or anybody else won't kick us off. And so y'all please come join us. Nathan, thank you for telling your story. And this needs to be discussed in further detail.
Thank y'all for giving me the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Oh, man, you're welcome. Wade, thank you for coming on, man.
Thanks, guys.
All right. And we will see y'all next week. Thank you.